Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 446. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Last week, we only had 2 shows because myself and co-host Connor Freeman were in Memphis for Freedom Fest. We had a great time, met a lot of listeners of the show, a lot of people who really love the Libertarian Institute. So it was a great time. Going to try to make it up to y'all and get a couple extra episodes out here before the end of the month. I'm guessing my Freedom Fest, our Port Fest speech will be up and rendered soon, so I'm going to try to put that out as an extra episode one of these weeks. Connor also gave one, so I'll do that as well. And just want to remind people to listen to the show, support the show, make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. And if you would be able to, we would appreciate any support you could give the Libertarian Institute. We are hosting a fundraiser now, so if you head on over to libertarianinstitute.org/donate, you could continue to support the work that I'm doing there, not only this show, but also writing articles. I've been putting out multiple news stories most days. I'm trying to do a lot of writing for the Institute. So please help us make sure that we could do that. All the money that we fundraise goes towards staff. We don't have any physical location or anything like that. We really just have payroll, and then maybe a little bit of money goes to helping us travel to these events to, promote our Institute, make new contacts and things like that. So help us continue to, run our Institute, go to events like Freedom Fest, Port Fest, and I will now just hop into the news. All right. So want to start up by catching up on a few stories from last week. And I think the most important thing is discussing what happened in Lithuania during the NATO summit and how this impacted Ukraine's membership. So the first story we got here, and this is from all the way a week ago, is that NATO announced that they would drop the member action plan for Ukraine. So NATO is set to drop the requirement for Ukraine to go through a membership action plan to join the alliance. This is called a MAP. The MAP is designed to ensure inspiring NATO members take reforms to meet certain political, economic, and military standards to join the alliance. Waiving the MAP would speed up Ukrainian membership if NATO ever formally invites Kiev to join. Between 1999 and 2020, every new NATO member that joined the alliance did go through a MAP, which is tailored to each country. However, Finland and Sweden were each invited to join the alliance last year without having to go through the MAP process. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba welcomed NATO's expected decision to drop the MAP requirement, but is asking for more as Kiev seeks a formal invitation to join the alliance, and at that point, and that did not happen. So Kuleba wrote on Twitter, following intensive talks, NATO allies have reached consensus on removing MAP from Ukraine's path to membership. I welcome this long-awaited decision that shortens our path to NATO. It is also the best moment to clarify the invitation to Ukraine to become a member. So this, may make a little bit of a difference. It may mean nothing, right? If Ukraine ever gets a formal invitation to join NATO, this will make that process probably shorter. However, at the time, NATO could say whatever they want, including you have to meet all these standards, and just not call it a MAP. To me, this really seemed like an effort by the North Atlantic Alliance to do something that really isn't doing anything at all. And so removing this MAP requirement for Ukraine seems to be that, where they're trying to make a show, but they're really doing nothing. And it seems that Zelensky realized this, because he was very upset. So this next story I have here from Date to Camp July 13th, antiwar.com, report U.S. almost scaled back NATO commitment for Ukraine over Zelensky tweet. The Washington Post reported on Thursday that U.S. officials at the NATO summit in Vilnius were so angry over Ukrainian President Zelensky's criticism that they almost scaled back the commitment they made to Ukraine in the NATO communique. As the alliance was working on the wording of its communique on Tuesday, Zelensky took to Twitter to air his grievances about Ukraine not getting a formal invitation to join NATO, calling it unprecedented and absurd. The final wording of the communique was vague with respect to Ukraine's future membership, only saying that NATO allies will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when the allies agree and conditions are met. Sources told the Post that the delegation was furious over Zelensky's tweet. NATO officials held informal talks to decide how to respond to the Ukrainian leader's criticism. According to European officials, the U.S. wants to get rid of the line about Ukraine's future invitation altogether. But ultimately, the U.S. delegation agreed to stick with the original language. The report said French President Macron pushed to keep the line about Ukraine's invitation in the communique and was backed by Central European countries and the Baltic states. The spat highlighted the divisions within NATO between the U.S. and Ukraine as the alliance was trying to put on a show of unity. The following day, British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said that Ukraine should show more gratitude for the tens of billions in military aid it has received from its Western backers. And so I find this all really interesting because I think there's a couple different pieces to it that we could talk about here. I think the first is, everybody saw the picture over the weekend of Ukraine. All the other European leaders, all the other NATO European leaders are standing there with their suits on. They're shaking hands. They're smiling. And Zelensky, this short little guy, is standing in his green jumpsuit all by himself with the biggest frown on his face. And is just visibly very upset about the situation going on. And a lot of people are mocking him, and justifiably so. Zelensky has been just a shill to try to get more weapons and to continue the war in Ukraine. He has unrealistic goals and is getting more and more Ukrainians killed to try to achieve them. However, from Kiev's perspective, the lack of commitment from NATO to actually one day allowing Ukraine to join the alliance makes it very clear that the idea that Ukraine will one day join NATO is just a false, thing that they're hanging out there in front of Kiev to keep Kiev fighting Russia. That's their main concern. They want Kiev to keep fighting Russia. And so to do that, they have to keep making these promises to Ukraine. And they'll do things like remove the need for Ukraine to have a membership action plan, a map, and then in the statement say that when Ukraine meets all the conditions necessary, they could join NATO, which is, what would have been laid out in a map anyways. And so, a lot of what NATO seems to be doing right now is trying to adopt rhetoric to appease Kiev and the more hawkish members of the alliance. And Zelensky saw that, and he's unhappy with that. And again, I think there's some, justified feelings there, as Ukrainians are the ones doing the fighting and the dying here. And this is, we're committing to send Ukraine more weapons so they could send more soldiers to the meat grinder, so they could, take out more Russian tanks and artillery positions and kill more Russian men, but, at the expense of Ukrainian men. So this is very disturbing. Now, I mentioned this just at the end of the last article, but I think it's worth highlighting. British Defense Minister says Ukraine needs to show more gratitude. And I think it's really important to see the position of Ukraine's Western backers, their attitude towards Kiev. So the British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said Wednesday that Ukraine needs to show more gratitude for the support it receives from the West when asked about Zelensky's criticism of the NATO communique. Whether we like it or not, people want to see a little bit of gratitude, Wallace told reporters. A day earlier, Zelensky wrote on Twitter that it was absurd that Ukraine was not given an invitation to join NATO or a timeline on when membership might happen. Wallace said that Ukraine had a habit of being ungrateful and treating its NATO backers like an Amazon warehouse. I told them last year when I drove 11 hours to be given a list that I'm not sure that I'm not like Amazon. Wallace told reporters on the sidelines of the second day of the NATO's Vilnius summit. And again, I think we should look at this and explore this just a little bit more, how much the West really just wants Ukrainians to keep fighting and dying in Ukraine. But, I think there's some evidence that they really don't want Ukraine to win this war. They only give Ukraine more advanced weapons when Ukraine's back is against the wall, and maybe Kiev will have to negotiate with Moscow just to keep its army from falling. And so then they'll pump in more weapons, then they'll help them plan another counteroffensive. But this idea that Kiev should be super grateful to the rest of the West for everything that they've given them when it's cost Ukraine hundreds of thousands of men, maybe more. It's just, disgusting the way that these Western leaders view the lives of Ukrainians, where, any protest over what's happening from the Ukrainian side is ungrateful and inappropriate because, we've given them so much. Now, from the position of a private citizen who does not want this war and this proxy war in Ukraine to be going on in the first place, yeah, it kind of upsets me when the Ukrainian leaders are demanding more and more, but I don't want to give them anything, and I don't want to let them into NATO either. And so I think there's a little bit of a different position where there's people in the U.S. who don't want to string Ukraine along anymore. We want to be honest with Ukraine that these are the limits of what we're going to give you, do your best, and then negotiate, where our leaders want to string Ukraine along and make sure they fight Russia, fight this war as long as possible. Now, as there was the NATO summit, and kind of as a separate thing, we had the Group of Seven make a statement as well. And so President Biden and the other Group of Seven leaders on Wednesday pledged long-term support for Ukraine and announced they would negotiate each a bilateral security deal with Kiev. And so this is from the G7 joint statement. Today, we are launching negotiations with Ukraine to formalize through bilateral security commitments and arrangements aligned with this multilateral framework in accordance with our respective legal and constitutional requirements, our enduring support to Ukraine. The G7 statement said each member will work with Ukraine on specific bilateral long-term security commitments and arrangements. The G7 includes the U.S., Italy, France, Japan, Germany, Britain, Canada, and the remainder of the European Union. The statement said that the bilateral security deals will include more military aid, training, intelligence sharing, cyber cooperation, and support for Ukraine's military-industrial complex. Biden recently floated the idea that the U.S. could support Ukraine the same way it backs Israel, which in turn includes long-term commitments to billions in military aid each year, but no mutual defense guarantees. And so I think that's kind of what we saw materialize in Vilnius, that the West is just going to keep giving Ukraine weapons, but nothing, no other security commitments. And again, I guess I should make this point on this show. I've been trying to make it a lot lately. I think one of the reasons that NATO doesn't want to give Ukraine a timeline on membership, and not that I support them doing so, I want NATO to tell Ukraine that it will never join the alliance, and then, leverage that with Moscow to try to end this war, to say, like, look, we'll close the doors to NATO's eastward expansion. However, you have to stop trying to take more Ukrainian territory or something like that. They really did pursue this Israel model and just giving Ukraine more and more arms. But the reason they don't want to promise them NATO membership one day is they say that you'll get NATO membership after the war ends, or you'll get NATO membership in a year or so. Then that kind of puts an end date on the war. That would make it so that Zelensky could negotiate an end to the war with Russia, and then feel like he could join NATO afterwards, and that would maybe incentivize Ukraine to end the war. So I really don't think they want anything that could possibly lead to Ukraine ending the war with Russia. All right, next up here, want to talk about some other developments from the NATO summit, and this is Sweden's membership. So Turkey's Erdogan agrees to back Sweden's NATO membership. And this came as something of a surprise to me. So last week, just before the summit was set to kick off in Lithuania, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that Erdogan had agreed to submit Sweden's accession protocols to Turkey's parliament, which needs to ratify Stockholm's NATO membership, and then Sweden can join the alliance. The announcement came after Erdogan and Stoltenberg met with the Swedish Prime Minister. In a joint statement, the leaders noted the efforts Sweden has taken to placate Turkey since last year's NATO summit in Madrid. And of course, for this whole year, Turkey has been responsible for preventing Sweden from joining the alliance. Turkey's main gripe with Sweden is its alleged support for the PKK, a Kurdish militant group that Turkey considers a terrorist organization. The statement said Sweden has amended its constitution, changed its laws, significantly expanded its counterterrorism cooperation against the PKK. Sweden also agreed to lift an arms embargo placed on Turkey in 2019 over a Turkish attack on Kurds in northeast Syria. The statement said that Sweden and Turkey have also agreed to establish a new bilateral security compact that will meet annually. At the first meeting of this security compact, Sweden will present a roadmap as the basis of its continued fight against terrorism in all forms. Erdogan's approval brings Sweden one step closer to becoming the 32nd member of NATO. Sweden is still awaiting approval from Hungary, and it's not clear at what point Budapest will sign off on Stockholm's bid. Although, as I have been predicting, and Dave DeCamp noted this in his story just a day later, Hungary expected to ratify Sweden's NATO bid this fall. I had suspected that Hungary didn't want to upset Russia unnecessarily by voting to admit Sweden into NATO. However, Hungary also didn't want to accept the rest of the members of the North Atlantic Alliance. And so as long as Turkey was willing to take the stand and to be the country that was officially blocking Sweden from joining NATO, Hungary was willing to drag its feet and not go ahead and approve the membership, but also, not to make a big deal out of it. And unlike Erdogan, Orban, the Hungarian leader, at least not publicly, hasn't made any demand saying that, Sweden and Finland need to do this, that, and the other to get approval. And so I really think Hungary was just kind of waiting on Turkey and basing their decision off of that. And that appears to be how it's playing out. Now, one thing that Turkey is getting is a lot of F-16s. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said, this was last Tuesday, that the Biden administration will move forward with a $20 billion sale of Lockheed Martin-made F-16 fighter jets to Turkey. Sullivan's comments came the day after Turkish President Erdogan agreed to back Sweden's NATO bid after a year of negotiations. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Erdogan would submit Sweden's NATO bid to Turkey's parliament for approval. And I really assume that, this is going to happen. It does have to go through Turkey's parliament. Erdogan could always change his mind. These things are possible. But the way all these different groups and bodies are moving here, the U.S., NATO, Sweden, Turkey, it seems like this is going to go through to me. Hungary's decision also. All right, this is, I believe, the last story that I have on the actual NATO summit. NATO to push back plans to open Liaison office in Japan. And I think this is probably because of France. France did not want to do this. And so, NATO decisions usually need a full consensus of the alliance. And so if France says no, that's enough to prevent from happening. The alliance had planned to formally enshrine the Japan office in NATO documents at the two-day summit in Vilnius, Lithuania that starts on Tuesday. But France's position is that the NATO alliance should stay within the North Atlantic. And this is good news to me, a good thing to see. And all right, let's move on here. The next article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute last week. Canada commits billions of dollars, hundreds of troops to NATO's eastern flank. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced a new military buildup in Eastern Europe. He claimed the move was needed to combat Russian aggression. While visiting Latvia, Trudeau said Ottawa would spend $2.6 billion and deploy about 1,400 troops to the Eastern European country. Canada is committing $2.6 billion in funding starting in 2023 to 2024 to renew and expand Operation Reassurance for 3 years. The statement from Trudeau's office explained. This operation is Canada's contribution to the biggest reinforcement of the alliance's effective collective defense in a generation and Canada's largest overseas mission with up to 2,200 troops to be persistently deployed, more than double the current deployment. Canada has about 800 soldiers in Latvia before Trudeau's declaration, and Ottawa will add about 1,400 troops to reach the new target. And I have seen different numbers here that Canada has up to 1,200 troops actually right now in Latvia, so the number of additional soldiers may be as low as 1,000 and then as high as 1,400. A lot of different sources have given different information on this, but 800 to 1,200 are already there. The new target is 2,000, so 2,200. So however the math works out, it's about 1,000, 1,400 troops that Canada will be sending. Operation Reassurance, the country's largest overseas mission, is the name Ottawa gave to its military buildup on NATO's eastern flank. The Canadian government stated that the goal of the operation is to deter Russian aggression and, if necessary, defend NATO territory. Ottawa has led NATO operations in Latvia over the past 6 years. In May, Canadian troops began training Ukrainian officers in Latvia. Earlier this year, Ottawa reinforces soldiers in Latvia with millions of dollars of anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons. The North Atlantic Alliance has sought to significantly boost its presence in 8 countries dubbed its eastern flank. Last month, Germany pledged to dramatically increase its military presence in Lithuania. So now let's go to Ukraine. This is, let's look at the actual battlefield and talk about that for a minute. Pentagon intelligence official says Ukraine war at a stalemate. A senior defense intelligence agency official has described the war in Ukraine as a stalemate and said that none of the weapons the U.S. and NATO are providing will help Ukrainian forces break through in their counteroffensive. Certainly, we are at a bit of a stalemate, DIA Chief of Staff John Kirchhofer said at a conference on Thursday, according to Bloomberg. One of the things that Russian leadership believes is that they can outlast the support for the West. Kirchhofer listed some of the weapons NATO recently began providing, including U.S. cluster bombs and British Storm Shadow missiles. None of these, unfortunately, are the holy grail that Ukrainians are looking for that will allow them to break through, he said. Ukrainian forces have struggled to make headway since launching their counteroffensive at the beginning of June. U.S. and European officials told the New York Times in a report published Saturday that 20% of all Ukrainian weaponry deployed to the battlefield was damaged or destroyed during the first 2 weeks of the counteroffensive. The official said that at the rate of losses has dropped to 10% in the ensuing weeks as Ukrainian forces were approaching Russian minefields more cautiously. The official did not offer figures on how many Ukrainian lives have been expended in the assault, as Kiev is keeping a tight lid on the number of casualties. Leading up to the counteroffensive, Discord leaks and media reports revealed that the U.S. did not expect Ukraine to regain any significant territory, but the Biden administration pushed for the assault anyways, as it is opposed to the idea of a ceasefire. All right, next up here, let's talk about those cluster bombs. This from July 13th. U.S. cluster bombs have arrived in Ukraine. A Ukrainian general told CNN on Thursday that Ukraine has received a shipment of U.S. cluster bombs, controversial munitions that have a devastating impact on civilians. The Ukrainian general said, "We got them. We haven't used them yet, but they can radically change the situation on the battlefield. And since this article has come out, I have seen a couple of videos that allege to show the Ukrainians using these cluster bombs. Don't know if that's true yet. Can't confirm it. Just wanted to mention that if anybody has seen those videos, that they may or may not be authentic. It's so hard to judge on a lot of the war footage coming from the battlefield in Ukraine. The Biden administration announced 2 weeks ago now that it was sending Ukraine cluster munitions in the form of 105 millimeter artillery shells as a part of a $800 million weapons package. It's not clear how many of the shells have arrived so far in Ukraine, but officials say they will provide hundreds of thousands of rounds. The cluster munitions are being provided using the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows Biden to ship Ukraine weapons directly from U.S. military stockpiles. Cluster bombs scatter small submunitions over large areas, making them especially hazardous for civilians. Some munitions that don't explode immediately can impact and kill or maim civilians for decades to come, as they have in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, where the U.S. dropped hundreds of millions of bomblets during the war in Vietnam. Now, we had a House vote on this that was voted down. House votes down amendment to block cluster bomb shipment to Ukraine. The House on Thursday night voted down an amendment to the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, that's the NDAA, that would have prohibited the transfer of cluster munitions to Ukraine. The amendment was led by Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene and failed on a vote of 147 to 276. The amendment received support from almost 100 Republicans and almost 50 Democrats. The night before the vote, Republicans on the House Rules Committee voted down the original amendment relating to cluster bombs that would have banned the export of the controversial munitions to all nations, not just Ukraine, which had bipartisan co-sponsors. The Republicans then added the narrowed-down Green Amendment, which was less likely to get Democratic support. Narrowing the amendment to Ukraine made it more of a vote against military aid to Ukraine rather than a vote against cluster bombs, and there has been virtually no dissent from Democrats on the President Biden's policy. But it is good that we saw 50 Democrats vote against this, and vote against sending them anyways, even in its current form. Now, all right, let's talk about the use of cluster bombs on the battlefield, because Putin is saying that Russia can use cluster bombs in a tit-for-tat response. Putin said Sunday that Russia has sufficient supply of cluster munitions to use in Ukraine and could employ the controversial weapons. Now, we have had reports throughout the war that Russia was using cluster bombs, and I do tend to think that there's at least some truth to that. I'm not sure if it's as extensive as everybody claims, but I think it's been widely reported that both Russia and Ukraine have used cluster bombs, and it's pretty well documented that both have in this war. So Putin is more or less saying that Russia hasn't used these weapons so far, but now Russia could roll them out. And one of the reasons that my guess is of why Russia hasn't used cluster bombs is because the battlefield is taking place in territory that Russia believes will one day become Russia. And so if Russia uses cluster bombs in that territory, then Russia, of course, will have to deal with those submunitions, that cleanup, and it will be people who are citizens of Russia, even if they're, ethnic Ukrainians or something, that are the ones, stepping on these bomblets for years to come. Additionally, from, hearing Douglas McGregor, Daniel Davis, and others have made this point, cluster munitions aren't a particularly effective offensive weapon, meaning that if you use cluster bombs and you hit all these targets, right, with cluster bombs, well, there's going to be some of those bomblets left that haven't exploded. And so if you're carrying out an offensive and you use the cluster bombs to take out an enemy position, and then you go to try to take over that enemy position, your soldiers, your vehicles could be killed or damaged by the bomblets, the submunitions. And so this is a real problem. And so my guess is that Putin's claim that Russia hasn't used the cluster bombs is probably untrue, but to the effect that Russia, to the extent that Russia hasn't used them widely, is probably true because Russia plans to carry out offensives and they want to take territory, and cluster bombs just aren't that effective of a weapon for that particular kind of operation. All right, now let's talk about F-16s. This from Day to Camp, July 13th. Lavrov says Russia will view F-16s in Ukraine as a nuclear threat. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Wednesday that Russia will view U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets in Ukraine as a nuclear threat because they are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. We have informed the nuclear powers, the United States, Britain, and France, that Russia cannot ignore the ability of these aircraft to carry nuclear weapons. No amount of assurances will help here. President Biden has given a green light for European countries to deliver F-16s for Ukraine, and 11 of Ukraine's Western backers announced on Tuesday that they would start training Ukrainian pilots on the U.S.-made aircraft in August. F-16s are capable of carrying U.S. B-61 nuclear gravity bombs, which the U.S. stores in several European countries under NATO's nuclear sharing program. There is no indication the U.S. is planning to arm Ukraine with the nukes, though, but Lavrov and Russia say they still take the threat seriously. And this is a statement from Lavrov. In the course of combat operations, our servicemen are not going to sort out whether each particular aircraft of this type is equipped to deliver nuclear weapons or not. We will regard the very fact that Ukrainian armed forces have such systems as a threat from the West in the nuclear sphere. And so that's a pretty big and important statement. So let's talk a little bit more about the training program that the Western countries are looking at. We had 11 members of NATO agreeing on Tuesday to start training for Ukrainian pilots on U.S.-made F-16s in Europe in August, the first step towards getting American-made fighter jets to the war zone in Ukraine. And this is interesting because we've had reports that this training was already underway. We've known that the U.S. was training a handful of Ukrainian pilots to kind of see what their abilities were, and that the UK was doing this as well. And so at a time, it was really unclear of when these F-16s would be getting to Ukraine. And now, with the announcement that the training program isn't starting until August, it seems completely impossible that the Ukrainians will be operating F-16s before the end of the year. I was even initially, when this announcement was first made, was thinking that spring of 24 would be about the earliest, and it could actually be the fall of 24 before these things end up making it to the battlefield. But let's get into a couple more details about this training program. According to Politico, the training will begin in Denmark and will also be held in Romania once a support station is established in the country. The first Ukrainian pilots are expected to complete their training by early next year. Denmark and the Netherlands are leading the program, and the other countries involved are Britain, Belgium, Canada, Luxembourg, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Romania, and Sweden. The Netherlands, Denmark, and Belgium are all expected to supply F-16s to Ukraine, but they have not made a final commitment. Biden has given the green light for European nations to deliver F-16s to Ukraine, and the U.S. has not ruled out the idea of sending their own F-16s to the country. The training plan was agreed to at the two-day NATO summit in Vilnius that started on Tuesday. The provision of Western-made fighter jets to Ukraine marks a significant escalation of the NATO involvement in the war. All right, so they are also considering giving Attackums to Ukraine. These reports have been floating around for a while, but the Biden administration is quietly debating whether or not to provide Ukraine with the Army Tactical Missile System, which is known as the Attackums, which have a range of up to 190 miles. The Wall Street Journal reported at the end of June that the administration was moving closer to providing Ukraine with Attackums, which would mark a significant escalation of U.S. military aid. But so far, no decision has been made, and some U.S. officials don't think the Pentagon has enough Attackums to spare for Ukraine. The U.S. has been depleting its military stockpiles for Ukraine, which is the excuse the administration used to start giving Ukraine cluster bombs, even though they will likely kill civilians decades after the war. Before leaving the NATO summit in Lithuania, President Biden appeared to acknowledge that he was considering arming Ukraine with the Attackums. He said, yes, but they already have the equivalent of Attackums now. Biden said when asked if he was thinking about sending the missiles, what we need most of all is artillery shells. They're in short supply, and we are working on them. Ukraine's really asking for the Attackums. I don't think that the Storm Shadow missiles really cover everything that the Attackums provide. The Storm Shadows and I think Scalp is the acronym that the French use, are 150-mile range air-launched cruise missiles. So they're pretty significantly different than the HIMARS and the Attackums. And Ukraine has really been demanding the Attackums for some time. So Germany plans to open a tank factory in Ukraine. They're planning to do this within the next 12 weeks. I'm not sure how this is going to work out, and my guess is that this gets destroyed pretty quickly. Next up here, the White House says reservists will provide administrative support. So last week, the White House said that 300 reservists were made available by President Biden for the Pentagon to deploy to Europe, and that then they clarified that they would serve administrative functions. These are people that are specialists in things like administrative functions, logistics, supply, and maybe medical, dental, and those kinds of things. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby told Fox News, the kind of enabling functions that you need to support and sustain a large troop presence for a time. Biden signed an executive order to support Operation Atlantic Resolve, the name of the U.S. military operations in Europe that are a response to the events in Ukraine. The mission was first established in 2014 after the U.S. backed the ouster of former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych that led Russia to annex the Crimean Peninsula and start a civil war in Ukraine. Since February 22, the U.S. has deployed over 20,000 additional troops to Europe, bringing the levels on the continent to over 100,000 for the first time since 2005. President Biden's order suggested that the U.S. military is strained by maintaining a large troop presence in Ukraine. Out of the 3,000 reservists, up to 450 could be pulled from what is known as the Individual Ready Reserve. This is the IRR. The people in the IRR have previously served in active duty, but have now reserve commitment they need to fulfill as a part of their contract. And so my understanding of how this works is that, let's say you're, signing to join the military, you're 22 or something like that. You sign a 4-year commitment. That means you're until you're 26. But until you're 30, actually, you could be called at any time by the military and moved back into service. And so, this is also different, just note, than like the Army reserves. You go, I think, 2 weekends a month and then 2 weeks at some point in the year to train and things like that. These aren't the same people. These people aren't training with the military at all, but they could still be called back. So this seems to be some good news. We had Russia's spy chief speaking with the CIA director. The head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, confirmed on Wednesday that he spoke with CIA Director William Burns after Prigozhin's, that's the head of the Wagner Group's, short-lived rebellion. The U.S. media outlet reported at the end of June that Burns phoned his counterpart to assure that the U.S. was not involved in Prigozhin's military mutiny, but the Russian spy chief said the two mostly discussed Ukraine. So good that we're having any talks at all between the U.S. and Ukraine. And again, as I have said several times on the show, so interesting that we are having our CIA director act as the main diplomat for this country. All right, Wagner fighters train soldiers in Belarus. I just want to note this because there's a lot of stories going on about what's happening with Prigozhin, what's happening with the Wagner fighters, why are they even in Belarus? And apparently there's a small number of Wagner fighters that have made their way to Belarus, and some of those fighters are going to be involved in training Belarusian forces. All right, everybody, that is where I'm wrapping up the show for today. please, if you can, if you got a little extra money, head on over to the Libertarian Institute, help us out with our fundraiser, make a donation. I really appreciate it. And we'll be back with more shows later in the week.